Hello, everybody. This is exciting, right? I'm thrilled to be on this platform with Ryan Graves, who I first met in May of 2019. So maybe we'll start there, Ryan, because I don't know, people here may know that I co-authored with Ralph Blumenthal and Helene Cooper. The second New York Times story that we did came out in 2019, in May of 2019, and it featured Ryan, and it was all about pilot, the encounters that he's been talking about for years ever since. And that story actually was the 10th most read story in the New York Times for that whole year. It actually was, I think, read by more people than the first story, which is hard to believe, but people loved it because the pilots were talking about what they actually saw. So I'll never forget the day that Ryan came to this hotel room in New York to meet with me and Ralph. And he was really nervous because he was taking a big step by coming out in the New York Times, being an active duty pilot. So maybe we could start, Ryan, by you describing what that was like and what motivated you to come forward, because you've accomplished so much since. I don't think you ever imagined you'd accomplish as much as you have. So what was going on for you then, and what motivated you to do that?
Yeah, thank you. And thank all of you for coming here. This is going to be an incredible event, and it's super reinforcing to be able to see this many interested people in this topic. Back in 2019, when I went to that nice but still somewhat scary hotel room to meet three people I had never met before, I was motivated by the same thing that motivated me to speak up about this for the first time, was that, you know, I know many of you have heard this before, but the reality is that pilots were experiencing objects that were a clear and present safety of flight issue, and there was no remedy to that solution. There was nothing that could be done. There was no mitigation of that risk. And in fact, it wasn't just unmitigated, it was something that we weren't even willing to talk about within the squadron. So we weren't even debriefing about this, leaving other pilots, even in the same squadron, vulnerable to the same safety issues that we had experienced. And so I saw going to the New York Times and speaking with Leslie and the others as a way to be able to bring awareness, not just to our squadron or to the military community, but even much more broadly into the commercial aviation community as well.
And you didn't suffer any immediate repercussions for doing it, right?
No. You know, I know that's a common question about whether I was told not to talk about this, or if you know, there were immediate repercussions for that behavior. You know, ultimately the risk that I perceived was mitigatable by myself, because I was doing it for the right reasons, and I was doing it for reasons that I thought any, you know, stakeholders that might have an issue with what I'm saying can't really argue against the fact that this is that clear and present issue for pilots that need to be dealt with.
Absolutely. Well, I had actually, you know, I started reporting on this in 2000. And the second story that I did in 2001 was about aviation safety. This was way back when the topic was totally taboo. But I always recognized how the importance of that aspect of the whole UAP, you know, how to reach people through, you know, in the official world by emphasizing aviation safety, because especially in those days, they had to have an excuse or a reason to even care. And so if you're telling them this is an aviation safety risk, they have to care, really. But in those days, they didn't, Ryan. I mean, the focus in the work I did was with commercial pilots more than you know, Navy or Air Force pilots, but they were like, nobody dared report this. And there was one brave individual named Richard Haynes. I don't know how many of you in this audience know or remember him. He's phenomenal, and he started a group called NARCAP, the National Aviation Reporting Center on Anonymous Phenomena, back in the early 2000s, and he wrote a 100-page report documenting aviation safety cases, which I wrote an article about, which went all over the place. He sent that report to all the aviation safety groups and all the pilots' unions, and nobody paid any attention to it. So I think, fast forward to what you're doing, it's really a different world now, because now people are paying attention, thanks to you.
Well, thank you, Leslie. And it's not thanks to me. I was just kind of an impetus where I could allow others to come forward and share their story, and that's really where the power of the conversation comes into play, to know that this wasn't just myself or my squadron, but this is something that commercial aviators, military aviators are experiencing, both in our national airspace as well as across the world. There are other methods to gather data about this topic. Aviation safety is not the end of the conversation, but it does really bring attention to this conversation in ways that aren't always obvious on the outside. It brings other organizations in. It allows for the conversations at high level in government. And that's where we see a lot of progress and momentum being able to be formed based off of this, simple problem stated simply.
Right. There's one case I'd love to show the audience, which was one of the cases in this report by Richard Haynes, which came out in the year 2000. And his cases went all the way back to the 1950s. And this was one of the cases, and it clearly shows an aviation safety hazard. But in this case, can you put the first slide up? Took place in 1981. And this was I don't know, some of you may be familiar with it because I wrote about it in my book, but this is a drawing from inside. Oh no, the first slide, please. Back. Yeah, that one. This is a drawing from inside the cockpit of what happened to him. This disc-shaped object kind of came out of the atmosphere. I mean, it just sort of appeared, and it was heading right for his window. And he and his co-pilot braced for a collision, and at the last minute, the object veered off. Next slide, please. Or I guess I'm supposed to do this here. And so he went to Richard Haynes, which was really rare in those days, because as I said, most pilots didn't report, but he filled this amazing report out, in which he described seeing this round object with a dark dot on the bottom and portholes, and he described how it came out of the atmosphere, it was also really large. It was the size of a grapefruit, which is really phenomenally large. Most people held at arm's length. In those days, they used to ask people all the time, what was the size of the object when you hold it at arm's length? And most people say a dime, a quarter. A grapefruit was really large. And this is a picture of him inside the cockpit showing that sort of grapefruit-sized object that he observed. But what I loved most about this report was when he was asked to show details, or describe some details, he said he observed a bending of the atmosphere. Now let's think about, what does that mean? He actually described seeing that. And one detail he told Haynes was that the sky in the area where the object sort of came out of the atmosphere through was a darker blue. There was an area that was a darker blue than the rest of the sky. And this thing just sort of seemed to emerge. So I just always found that fascinating, a bending of the atmosphere, as if there's some kind of space-time distortion or who knows what's going on. But it pointed to the authenticity of what he saw. He also described that it had windows evenly spaced around the edges, and he was positive it was a spaceship. So that's clearly an aviation safety issue. And regardless of Haynes's publicizing that case, it never made any difference to anybody. But it was back in 1981. So anyway, I just thought it would be interesting for people to see that. But let's talk about some of the things that you've done, Ryan, since you came forward in the New York Times story and you talked about what your squadron was seeing and dealing with. And then you've been involved with all kinds of meetings and briefings and legislation. So maybe you could update us on what some of those things are that you've been doing?
Yeah, certainly. And before I do that, I just want to share two quick stories to relate to what you shared. These are historical reports, and we can go back into Google and find all sorts of interesting images and stories. But this is what drives me today, is that a lot of these cases are still happening today to some degree. So I'll share two quick ones with you. One on the commercial and one on the military side. 737, fully loaded with passengers, is taking off from South Africa and is climbing through about 15,000 feet. When off their nose, they spot a small black triangle, as best they can tell. Pilot looks away, checks his instruments, comes back, and now it's the size of a TV set in his windscreen. And as he watches it, this object grows to an estimated size of about 100 yards in length, and it flies within 500 feet of this passenger aircraft near Johannesburg. The pilot was so flabbergasted by what he saw, he tried to call it out to air traffic control, who did not see it. And just as a quick aside, 500 feet is our safety bubble in a tactical jet. So when we go do a dogfight, that's kind of our minimally viable distance from another fighter. So 500 feet from a fully loaded commercial airliner is a major deal. The pilot was so disturbed by what he saw as he was working his way down his decision tree of what this could be, he ended up self-administering a drug test to himself the following morning to see if perhaps, as he was thinking about this, my pilot or my co-pilot and myself, we see the same thing. Maybe we're both drugged, but that's kind of the mental state after seeing something that's this incredulous, especially as a pilot who is very pragmatic in the cockpit. How do they process that? What does that do for the rest of their flight? I don't think we want our pilots to have existential crisis while they're flying their aircraft. And that's why it's important to have these outlets for them to go to, like my nonprofit, Americans for Safe Aerospace, where we can accept those reports, we can process them and share them with scientific community and other groups to be able to evaluate what to do in the future and build a basis of scientific papers and reports that we can utilize and point to say, yes, this is the best reporting system, this is the best process. And that's just an example of some of the cases or one of the cases that motivate me today. Another, and I'll be brief on this, is still seeing orbs in various training areas for fighter aircraft. And even recently there was one where two aircraft were entering a dogfight when one of these objects went past their aircraft. Initially thought it was a balloon until they essentially saw it change position and outpace one of the fighters. This is a perfect example of when doing these complex maneuvers, we now have to account for these other objects that are not being briefed as a safety issue. And again, this is why the reporting is so important, so that the military community and commercial, of course, can be educated on what the proper procedures are so they can expect these risks instead of learning about them on the fly. And this is what's guided my work with Americans for Safe Aerospace, to provide that haven to be able to come, share a report, non-judgmental, from an aviator, speak the same language, and then we can, again, execute on those reports. And those reports have really started to guide our public awareness communications. It's started to really shape the legislation that we've advised on in Congress. We do have one bill, the Safe Aerospace for Americans Act, that was introduced by Congressman Grothman and Garcia in the House. We advised on that legislation. We vetted it across the aviation community, all the stakeholders involved. It did not get voted on last year due to procedural issues, but we're very optimistic that it will get voted on this year and hopefully pass into law. And this legislation will require the FAA to accept these reports from pilots, to gather additional evidence such as communication data or radar data that might exist, and funnel that information to the aviation safety reporting system that's managed by NASA. And that's a publicly accessible database that will allow for the scientific community to evaluate those reports. It also requires NASA to undergo a education process with pilots so they know how to use that system, as well as to reduce the stigma of actually reporting these events. And some other work that has been going on. I've had the opportunity to brief this conversation to various groups that are somewhat outside of this bubble, and be able to educate new folks on the importance of this topic. Recently, the White House Space Economy and Low Earth Orbit Working Group invited myself and others to have a conversation about deep technology, edge capabilities, propulsion, material science, energy generation. And they invited leadership from all the different interagency across the United States: DoD, DOE, DARPA, National Institute of Standard Technology, NASA. There was about 100 people on the call. And about 30% of the conversation was centered around UAP, what they are, what our experiences were, what the current state of sightings are. And it was almost a carrot, if you will, for the larger conversation around these edge technologies that may have a role to play in better understanding the phenomenon that we're seeing. And it was very well received, and those are the type of high-level conversations that I think are really going to affect change at that high level so that we can see progress both on the reporting side and, of course, on the disclosure side as well.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing how much progress has been made in the last 7 years.
Well, I want to thank you,
let's say less
Leslie.
than that, because you didn't begin until 2019.
Yeah, but
so.
thank you. I mean, as you said, that that article in 2019 and the work that you've done before is as popular as it is today really kind of set the stage for us to be able to come in and affect these changes.
Well, thank you.
Can we give it up for Leslie? Thank you.
I have to thank Luis Elizondo, actually, because if he hadn't resigned from the Pentagon and come forward, we wouldn't have had a New York Times story. So he really was the instigator for the whole thing. But yeah, right? And Chris Mellon as well. And Chris Mellon, who worked closely with him at the time. It's interesting to think about the aviation safety issues, such as that collision that I just showed the picture of, because Dr. Haynes used to emphasize that the real problem here was the possibility of human error in response to the UAP. When it comes to safety issues, it wasn't so much that the UAP were likely to intentionally collide or do something like that because of their extreme ability to maneuver in incredible, sophisticated ways. As we all know, they could easily avoid a collision. So his focus was, the risk was human error in response, and also when the equipment goes out, which it happens a lot, onboard communications go out or everything goes haywire in the cockpit, that can confuse the crew, so it's the human beings that need to be educated about the UAP. Would you agree with that? We don't really have to worry about them bumping into us or being aggressive with us.
Yeah, that's how I view the safety threat itself. It's not necessarily that these aircraft are going to have a collision with an aircraft. We have to make the assumption that they have very advanced sensing capabilities and object avoidance capabilities. But when a pilot is not expecting to see something up in front in their cockpit at a close range, they're going to react to that object. And although they might technically be in a safe position because there's no imminent collision, they're going to assume there is, and they're going to try to maneuver away, especially in the fighter community when you may have another fighter off your wing, or in the commercial world where you can have serious injuries just from maneuvering the aircraft too abruptly with all the passengers on it.
Right, and there were some cases like that where there were just such sudden maneuvers that passengers were injured. But I think it's a combination of the maneuvers plus the ontological shock. If they're seeing something that's not supposed to exist or something really strange, it's going to be a huge distraction. So they've got to be, the education seems to be the really key thing. That's what seems to me anyway. Yeah. Yeah,
and I think that starts with some of the legislation we put forward that is going to allow or enable NASA going to require NASA, not enable them, to go about this public education campaign to be able to not just teach them how to report, but this is going to allow for a wide swath of people that were maybe not otherwise exposed to the situation to now be receiving from an organization they respect that this is a reality that they have to prepare themselves for. Right.
And so I was also, I was working pre-2017, writing my book and everything. I was so shocked by the fact that the FAA manual actually told its pilots and crew, if you see a UFO, you have to go to a civilian group such as Newfork or your local law enforcement, whatever that means. If you're flying at 40,000 feet, is there local law enforcement available to you? But it said that, and then for a while it was Robert Bigelow, and I was just so shocked that it wasn't just ignoring it. It was literally telling them, we don't want to hear about this, go somewhere else. Just take it to the civilians who are fooling around with this silly stuff. So is that still the case today, that the manual says that?
Yeah, it is. It has not been updated. This legislation would allow these new processes to be implemented under those federal aviation regulations.
That's why that legislation is so important, because that's got to change.
Agreed,
right?
Yeah. Well, was there any legislation that Dr. Haynes back in the day, through your research, was able to get through or advise on?
Are you kidding? In those days, he couldn't even get them to read his study of these 100 cases. I mean, when I was working pre-2017, it was the only message that I could focus on in those days was UFOs are real, folks. There are real physical objects, and we don't know what they are. And even that was considered radical. So when he sent that report around, there's no way we could get anywhere close to legislation then. It was really about, is anybody in the aviation world going to pay attention? And not one of them did. Not one of them. Yeah.
What do you think comes next as far as how this conversation is going to evolve, perhaps in the aviation community, perhaps more broadly?
I mean, assumedly, if your legislation gets through, that's going to change everything, because the FAA will be forced to behave in a way that's responsible towards this issue. And I think that'll be a really, really big jump forward in the aviation safety world. And then the pilots, I assume, will feel less afraid, right? The stigma will be diminished. They'll be actually given a reporting mechanism. So I don't know. I feel like that's a huge development, and I really hope it comes to pass. It could really change things.
Yeah. You know, this is all kind of part of a broad conversation in the atmosphere about air traffic management. But there's other domains, such as space traffic management as well. And there are a lot of very interesting problems in that space as well, with debris, with adversarial systems advancing, with over 90,000 rocket launches by 2030 planned. It's coming to be a very congested airspace or space, and we also have to account for how are we evaluating UAP in space? There's a lot of conversations about these objects exiting or entering the atmosphere, and low Earth orbit is becoming increasingly crowded, and if our systems are not capable of being able to identify or track and identify these objects, then it's just increasing the same risk that they have in the aeronautical regime. So some of the work that I've been doing on the side is to develop certain advanced artificial intelligence algorithms that we're able to incorporate into what we call event-driven cameras. And this technology allows us to put together a very sophisticated detection and tracking system that is very applicable for the detection of high-speed moving objects, especially in space. And so we're working to test those algorithms on a launch coming up in this February, and hoping to have a product done by June of this next year. Or excuse me, we're looking to test the product in space as a full package by June of 2026. And this is going to allow for eyes in orbit to be able to detect these anomalous objects, adversarial systems, and even just the debris that's out there, and be able to funnel it into a single data source that we can evaluate, much like we're looking to evaluate information within the atmosphere.
It's awesome. You know, I was looking over, so everybody knows that Ryan was a witness. He testified in an open hearing before Congress last summer with David Gresh and David Fravor. I was reading over your statement that you presented to Congress, saying what you thought the next step should be. And one of the things you said was that, you know, these safety cases are grossly unreported in the current time. Now, it's been a little over a year since you made that statement. I'm just curious, since you testified in Congress, did that help bring more reports? Have the reports been increasing dramatically that have come to you since then?
Yeah, absolutely. And not just to myself as well, but there's been an increase of what might be considered, although not always specific, UAP cases within the aviation safety reporting system at NASA. So although, I mean, we've seen an increase as well, but I think through the other standard channels, there's been an increase as the stigma has been reduced. You know, it's kind of like a wave, right? You have some people that are totally bought in on one side of the crest, and on the other side, perhaps they haven't had those experiences or spoke to someone they trusted, and are still very unwilling to report. I recently went to a conference for naval aviators, specifically the tactical community, and had the opportunity to talk with a number of pilots that are flying right now to hear what their experiences are. Some of them, I mean, probably about, you know, at least 3/4 of the room had seen something. I would probably estimate that might translate to 50% of the wider community. They're talking about it now in their briefs before they go flying in some instances. On the other hand, some are, you know, scared to even share their report at all. Maybe have only shared it with their spouse, and now sharing with me. So not everyone's on the side. The stigma has reduced. The education, I think, is what's lacking at this point to get everyone kind of better read into what to look for and to understand that this is a real issue that they need to take serious.
Right. I mean, and it seems like the commercial pilots have kind of been left behind because they really depend on the FAA. And, you know, military pilots seem like they've had more attention and they've come forward more than the commercial pilots.
Yeah, you know, there's a process now on the military side for them to submit these reports. It's not very well communicated, and so it's hard to really judge what the true numbers are. On the commercial side, there's a similar problem. It's very scattered. A lot of these pilots were scared to even report this to their co-pilots a few years ago. Now they're going out to the air traffic control, reporting it. Theoretically, air traffic control should be taking this information down and subsequently filing a report, although I would estimate that's very rare that that actually happens. There's also internal command centers for each major airline as well that serves as a safety hub, and they have their own internal safety process. And so there are these, I think they're starting to accept these reports. I've spoken with them, and so the data is getting generated right now, but it's kind of scattered about and not very accessible, which I think that legislation would help bring that all to one centralized location.
Really great. Yeah, we for this series I'm working on, the National Geographic series, we just completed season 2, and Ryan was part of it. He's also part of season 1. But we're doing a whole episode on commercial pilots, and there was one pilot who actually was willing to go on camera with us. He actually got a video of this UFO from his pilot, from the plane, but he was not willing to go on the record with who his airline was. He would not say who his airline was because, again, obviously there's still some kind of fear about that. And, it just was an illustration. Even though he had the data of a multiple witness sighting with a video, he was still afraid to say what his airline was for fear of repercussions. Are you surprised?
I'm not surprised, no. And some airlines have issued cease and desist orders to various pilots to talk about this publicly. And on that topic, are there any pilots in the crowd today? All right, very good. Well, I look forward to speaking with you.
Yeah.
Do you get reports, in your role as a journalist now? Do people come to you at all?
Occasionally, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's more, not so much pilots, although we did a lot of work on finding them for our series, and we did meet some really interesting pilots there. I've talked more to sort of behind-the-scenes sources about lots of stuff off the record. But when I did my first story on this in 2000, it was about the French report called the Cometa Report. I did a story for the Boston Globe, and that was the report that changed my life. But the emphasis in that report, too, from the French authorities was on the need to educate pilots. It was all about, if they suddenly see something out their window that they have been told isn't real, or in those days they were told they don't even exist. It's such a shock. So, and then when that story came out, Ryan, lots of pilots contacted me because we mentioned that in the story, and they had never. They would come email me and say, "I've never felt I could tell this to anybody before." So that story, the importance of getting this information into the mainstream media in very serious ways. For that first story, I was able to write a long piece. It was detailed. It dealt with national security and aviation safety, and it was a miracle I could ever do it because there was such a taboo then. But it really made an impression, and it did bring a lot of pilots forward. I think a lot of them really want to talk, but they're afraid. And also with the 2006 O'Hare Airport case, which maybe many people are familiar with here, which I looked into at great length, and there were 13 witnesses who spoke to Dr. Haynes and his team for a long study they did on the case because nobody else would do anything on it. And none of them would go on the record, not one of those witnesses. And all they would have been doing was just saying what they saw. And a lot of people saw it. There was no question about what was there. So it wasn't like that much of a risk. But nonetheless, not one of them was willing to put their name on the record. I hope that would be different today. I think it would be in a multiple witness sighting like that. This case involved a disc hovering over O'Hare Airport, gate C-17, for at least 5 minutes. And lots of pilots and air crew and people on the tarmac and regular people saw it. And then it just went straight up through the clouds. All of a sudden, there was a cloud bank above it, and it went straight up really fast and left a hole in the cloud like a cookie cutter. It was absolutely phenomenal how fast it was. And the FAA, we talked about the FAA. They were forced to respond because the Chicago Tribune did a front page story on this, which got more hits than any story they had ever released in the history of the newspaper. So the reporter there, John Hilkovich, went to the FAA, and their first explanation was that it was lights reflecting on it was sort of a drizzle or something. It was airport lights reflecting on the sky in some way. But then he found out the airport lights had not been turned on yet at that time. So their second explanation was it was a weather phenomenon. So I realized there's only one kind of weather phenomenon they could ever attribute to a disk, and that would be something called a hole punch cloud. And it was because partly the thing went through the cloud and cut a hole in it. So they were assuming it was a hole punch cloud, and this is a phenomenon where ice from one cloud falls to a cloud below and melts a hole in that cloud. So you look up and you'll see a cloud with a hole in it. So I thought, okay, was this disk related to a hole punch cloud? I called up a bunch of cloud weather experts from, 3 or 4 of them from different universities, and all of them told me it could not possibly have been a hole punch cloud because it was too warm. It was above freezing. It was around 50 degrees that day, and you have to have freezing temperatures for a hole punch cloud. So that explanation didn't work either, and that was the extent of the FAA's involvement in this case. They would not acknowledge, well, this is something we can't explain, or yes, this was a safety hazard, or nothing. It was just 2 bogus explanations. That's it. That's all we have to say.
Well, I think we're living in a little bit different world now, right?
Absolutely. And again, I really thank you for all the work you've done, Ryan. I mean, whoever would have known that day you came forward what would have happened? And here you were testifying before Congress. I mean, this young man has done amazing things. So let's have a hand for him.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you. I think that's our time. Thank you, everyone.
We're being told to wrap up. Looking forward to talking to all of you, and we're going to have a great conference, and thank you all so much for being here and listening to us.